In this episode, I had the unique opportunity to interview the Vice President of the Law Society of England and Wales, Brett Dixon. I asked him what he sees the future of law really looking like for not only lawyers but the actual law itself. What we discussed and what he raised was the fact that AI works by spotting patterns. It looks at what's been done before, weighs it up, and predicts the most likely outcome. That's why it's so useful in law and in our daily lives generally, especially for research, drafting, and strategy. But the decisions that actually change the law don't come from what's most likely. They come from the people who change it. The moments that redefine justice happen when someone looks at the patterns, the precedents, and the actual scenario, the situation, the context at hand, and makes a judgment based on all these factors put together. It's very much judgment-based and context-based. AI can show us where the law has been, but it can't really decide what should go next. This is where the conversation about AI in the legal industry really gets interesting. So, Brett, the legal system, the UK legal system, is globally respected, I think it's safe to say. Do you see the potential reliance on AI within the legal justice system kind of eroding that trust in some way, potentially?
I mean, I think the starting point is that if you think about the UK justice system, and one of the things that's often been said to me when I've been on my travels for the Law Society is that you are the gold standard. You are the mother of common law. So we are the system that most jurisdictions look to emulate. We're the jurisdiction that most undertakes commercial work. So we are at the heart of global trade. So there is very much something definitely there that needs carefully nurturing and maintaining. And I suppose over the years, the truth is that there have been a number of challenges to how our justice systems work. We're in an age now where digitization and AI are becoming more and more important and more relevant, but also we're starting to see some of the fractures that can cause. So if you think about the obvious things that come up in the headlines, hallucinations in AI. So one of the, I think, most important things about a lawyer's role in front of a court is that you're transparent and honest. And I think that extends to everybody who takes part in a court process. And if you start off with those basic building blocks, then you start to see the problem. You start to see that if you, for example, rely on AI to take decisions, it doesn't always set out its reasoning. There's a reason that judges set out their reasoning. It's so you understand what has happened, so you understand that justice has been done, or so you can challenge it if you think it's wrong. So that's the first risk, in a way, that comes from AI. The second risk, coming back to hallucinations, is that it is dreadfully convincing sometimes with its hallucinations. I was talking about this recently on a training course I did for PI lawyers, and they were saying, well, how do you spot them? What are the red flags? And red flags really are about, well, the most obvious one is, how many times, if you're a lawyer, have you dealt with a case where you come across a case authority that looks identical to the facts that you're dealing with? It's like, oh my word, that is on all fours completely. In other words, it looks too good to be true. And if it looks too good to be true, then you should be looking further in relation to that. The other difficulty is that when I listen to people talk about AI, there are a few things that come out. The first one is a fear, because it's artificial intelligence. So it's going to be something that replaces you. And there's a whole raft of reasons we can talk about as we go along. I'm trying to stick to the question you've asked. But the other thing that comes out is there are those that think it's a solution to most things. So if you say, well, this is the problem, say you're building a part of the justice system and you have a conversation, you say, well, part of the problem is the huge backlogs. What are we going to do about it? How are we going to build things out so it's more accessible, more usable, but maintains those standards. And the response you sometimes get back is, well, AI can do that, can't it? And you say, yeah, but how? What is it actually going to do? And it's when you get to that you start to get to the kernel, the bit, sounding like a proper geek now, the bit right at the heart of it that runs almost the operating system of the justice system, which is integrity and transparency. You stick to those focused words, then you start to understand that it needs to be visible, what it does, and it needs to be human-centric. So I like to think of artificial intelligence as more like augmented intelligence. So you use it as a tool to assist you. So I would expect, say, in a case law environment, to use it to sift through the huge amounts of disclosure, to identify certain trends, keywords for me that I could then review. And if you then look at the other end of what comes out from AI, you get into hallucination territory. A very well-known judge and I tried to figure out about 5 years ago what AI was in a legal context. And we decided in a pub, because we're obviously, English, and that's where most things are decided. We decided that it was like a talented research assistant you just didn't quite trust. And that's not a bad thing. But you need to know your subject matter. You need to know what the output is as well as what's going in it. What's the expected thing? What looks out of the normal or different?
Each week, I take what I'm hearing in conversations with legal leaders. I analyse the market and track emerging trends in this AI era. In my newsletter called The Future Lawyer, Market Intel for the AI Era, I'm focused on what AI is exposing, the opportunities, the blind spots, and the shifts shaping the next 5 years. This is how you see the chessboard before everyone else does.
So it's about having somebody, a human at the centre of this, that is able to say, this is what it looks like. So back to your question, if we bear all of those things in mind, I don't think relying on AI done properly will erode trust. What it will do is actually set us out as a jurisdiction that is forward thinking. And the real benefit is not just in terms of how much international trade can you shift or how much high value work can you move. It's in some ways about democratizing access to justice. It's giving people the right tools to be able to interact properly, but providing guardrails or tram lines that keep them safe. And from time to time, that will obviously look like a lawyer, because that's what lawyers do best. They look after their clients. It's why I got into the law. It was to help people who were in difficult situations. So that's, broadly how I think about it and how I hope that the digital justice system involved in building out will eventually look like.
I think that's a very, very positive way of looking at it. And I think you are right. I do agree in many ways that it will position us as a forward-thinking jurisdiction and potentially encourage other jurisdictions to continue working with us and to continue having that kind of level of respect as well that they always have done. But I think it can also easily go in the opposite direction as well if it's not carefully kind of dealt with. And I think we're in a very pivotal time at the moment whereby the steps that we take will potentially determine that level of trust.
If you stand back from the main problem, the main visible problem, which is hallucinations, and you think about how AI works, I mean, it's in many respects a probability engine. All it does is look at the series of words in front of it, figure out what's the most probable thing to come from the basis of its huge raft of knowledge that the rest of us couldn't possibly manage to ingest and keep in us. But sometimes that leads it to come up with what he thinks are plausible things. What's the most likely outcome and things like that. So in terms of the justice system, there's an opportunity here in some respects if we start to think about how we make the rules that govern how the justice system works in a different way. So at the minute, pretty much every lawyer would understand what the white book or the green book is. They would realise that it's this very big thing that's got so many pages in it that they decided to print it on paper that looks a bit like toilet paper. It has to be that thin to be able to fit it in it, and there's more than one volume of it. So all of that exists in a digital space, and if someone comes along to the court system and they say, what am I supposed to do about filing my witness statement or starting a claim? The AI will look at the white book, it'll digest it, and it'll say, well, this is my interpretation of it. So the opportunity in building a justice system at the minute is to step away from that type of rulemaking and focus instead on the screens, the thing that somebody interacts with. So rather than it being a set of rules or instructions that says how something should be done, you focus on the user experience, the user interface. So we're all familiar with, the website where you have to put in your details in order to get the product shipped to you, and it won't let you get past that first page if you don't put your postcode in properly. So governed properly through the proper approach to making rules, which is the rule committees, focusing on what the screens do and say gives you an opportunity to ensure that you are taking that extra interpretive step out of it, of the AI, and you are giving somebody something that they, in effect, just have to fill in. And if there are problems with it, that's when you have an appeal process. If things go wrong, that's what we've always had. So there's an opportunity to start thinking about how people interact with the court system to try and ameliorate some of the potential risks with AI.
It does make sense. And I would love to hear from you in terms of what you think, if you're able to share, what do you think regulation potentially looks like now, but also in the future as well?
The starting point really for me is, as you can imagine, I've been involved in it, the Law Society's strategy around AI, which is focusing on really three things: innovation, impact, and integrity, which, obviously innovation and impact talk for themselves in some respect, but it's the integrity that really matters, because that, in a way, is the part that will link the human in the loop to the role that the AI has, because you are checking what goes in and you're checking what comes out. And if you accept, certainly on the basis of the current AI models, that there is that requirement for a human in the loop, and or you accept that the outcomes are probably going to be better with a human in the loop, and I can explain that in a minute why I think they are, then you recognize that the current model and approach to regulating lawyers still matters, because it's the human who manages, conducts, authorizes the steps in the litigation on behalf of the client, and ultimately carries the can if you get it wrong. That's why solicitors have indemnity insurance, because it's human to get things wrong from time to time. But if I was, I don't know, buying something online, I'm very unlikely to buy it from someone I have no idea who they are, but I'm very likely to buy it, from some other supplier that is visible and I would know where to go to when something goes wrong and there's a degree of safety. So consumers think about the same things, whether it's, thinking about someone who's going to help you buy your house, do that transaction, whether it's someone's going to help you navigate the difficulties when a loved one dies, or if you are selling your business, or even, and I'll get in trouble for saying this, getting a divorce or something, which I'm not, by the way, but just mentioning the word scares me whilst I'm at home, because it might be taken the wrong way. But people think about things in the same way, about protection, safety. And if you put consumer interest at the heart of it, then you start to think, actually, the human in the loop has benefits because there's somewhere visible to go. And in some respects, it's a facet of what's being talked about already in relation to driverless cars or automated vehicles. If you think about this from the perspective of a claimant personal injury lawyer, which I originally was, then you start to think about, well, so if this driverless car runs my client over, or there are a passenger in it and it has a crash, where do they go to get recompense? Where do they go to get things put right to help them rebuild the shattered lives? And there's no driver. So you think, well, where else might you go? Well, who provided the car? Okay, that's one possibility. Well, who wrote the rules that tell it how it's supposed to drive and interact with other road users? You want to be going that far down the chain? So the automated vehicle approach is that it sits on the current insurance system, that there would be an insurance policy in place in relation to the car, rather than having to go all the way down the chain to figure out who's at fault and potentially end up in litigation, say with Google, Nvidia, or any other big tech player, which is not what you want to do if you've just had a relatively minor accident in the street. Part of it's about simplicity, and simplicity is that if you go to and you interact with a lawyer and a law firm for the help, then what you want to do if things go wrong is get them to put it right, not to have to chase down a load of different liability rabbit holes. So broadly, it looks, until things change, if there is another development, it looks like it is now, because the human in the loop is so important to the whole process being understandable, rational, and actually delivering on what the client needs.
It's a brilliant point, actually, because people don't think about this, when using AI and automated things. They don't think, actually, if this goes wrong, who can I actually go to? They just think, oh, this is so easy and efficient and it saves me time. But they don't think what happens, if something happens. But I think that, again, this is a really logical and nice way to look at it, and a positive way to look at it. But I think the reality is, from what I see, and this is across the world, people are just implementing AI and coming up with these, AI native law firms. And yes, there is a human there and they probably are in the loop. But how can one human be in the loop when this AI is handling hundreds of client cases? It's just, I think what you're saying is completely accurate and logical. But as I say, the reality of what's happening is not that,
No, they things always depart when you get to reality to some extent. But we live in a moment in time now where I hesitate to say Mazur, because it's a bit like saying Beetlejuice. If you say 3 times, it'll come back to get you in some way. But we've just had a whole moment in the legal sphere that ended up in the Court of Appeal, where the court talked about delegation, about supervision, and about how it had to broadly be effective. So, the description of a law firm that relies on something, whether it's a person or a series of persons who aren't authorized to do the work, but are supervised by one individual. Well, it's the same question where one person, in effect, supervises and curates the output from artificial intelligence. I mean, in some respects, it's worse, because artificial intelligence sometimes makes things up that are believable. And also it's so much quicker. So the throughput of data that would come to the individual supervising all the different work that comes from those AI agents would be overwhelming. So there probably does need to be some thought as to how the approach to AI in some places can actually work if there is going to be proper supervision. I don't say that happens in, some of the firms that we see that are authorized to do the work, because they will have to be mindful to their professional duty when they do that. I think the bigger risk comes from the firms that advertise themselves as AI first, and they are a step removed from someone who holds a practicing certificate, for example, and they are saying, well, look, some of these issues are so simple and so amenable to AI dealing with them. Come to me, I'll charge a whole lot less, you'll save a whole lot of money. But we're back to that point about, where would you buy something from if you're worried about if things go wrong, or you're worried about it being correct, or even more worrying, whether or not the person's even thinking about the things that might matter to you that perhaps you haven't thought about. So if you think about, a simple business transaction, if you went to an AI first approach, so you just basically put it in the AI and said, these are the facts of the business dispute, what can I do? It'll go through its probability matrix, it'll come up with advice based upon a series of different things that will probably tell you what is the most likely outcome in relation to the actual dispute. But if you then think about what that dispute is, it's a person, for example, who regularly interacts with the other party. So they have repeat business. It's someone who, buys X amount of things for them and then packages them up and sells them on to something else. What's really important in that context is not breaking the business relationship. And that's not something that AI would consider unless you specifically said to it, you prompted it properly and said, like, I'm a bit worried about this. So it would miss the nuance. So what someone's come to you with that business dispute is not, I want this dispute sorting out. I want to get back to where I was. I want my interaction with this person to be back to where it was. And yes, I'd like the dispute sorted out, but I'm pretty flexible about that as long as it doesn't affect the ongoing business or trade I do with them. And that's the difference. That's the human element. When you look at it, it's not just about having someone to go to, it's about someone actually thinking about and giving you a creative solution and a solution that's human-centric.
Yeah, I think a lot of areas of law, like personal injury, immigration, family, where a lot of emotion comes into play, and clients go to these lawyers, and a lot of the time it is emotional. It is them, wanting to have a shoulder to cry on or somebody to vent to. You've worked in personal injury, so have I. I've worked in immigration. Yeah. There's such emotional areas. Often you're speaking on the phone to a client and they're just saying, "Oh, my back hurts." So they want that.
Yeah, I mean, some of the personal injury cases I've dealt with, some of the people who've been dreadfully and catastrophically injured. It is more a holistic role rather than just a black letter law role. You're thinking about, from your experience, what's worked, what maintains the family. Often you're thinking about what can be done in the short term to fund rehabilitation needs that can maintain them in the family home and things like that, which again are things that may not occur to someone who is told, look, these are your tram lines. I just want a solution to this problem. Who's at fault? What compensation can I expect? Whereas the human appreciates actually much of these things at that level are not about compensation. It's about supporting someone in rebuilding what they've lost. And the law can only deal with it in terms of money because there are no magic wands.
I imagine spoken to many different law firms and lawyers. I know you travel up and down the country because you talk about it on LinkedIn. I love your posts where you've done a week in the life of.
Yeah, I'm always a bit behind with that week, so it's not a current week, just as a disclaimer.
That's good. I love those posts, and I think people listening should definitely check them out because it's interesting and it caught my attention actually, which is why I reached out to you. So I know that you've got a busy role in the Law Society, and I imagine you speak to many different people. What is the general consensus in terms of this talk of AI within the legal industry? What are law firms saying to you? What are their real feelings?
I suppose the first thing to say is that there are, I think, 210,000 solicitors in England and Wales. So I obviously don't speak to all of them. But, I mean, the broader point is that we are such a broad church. You go from, a high street in Cumbria, or dare I say even Burnley, for those of you who know where the centre of the universe is. It's close to Turf Moor, in my opinion, to big city firms. And just like any other business, there is a resource issue and there's also a time issue. So in a bigger firm, you have more resource to be able to identify what it is you want and need in your practice, how it will work for you. And you have the ability to buy in outside expertise if you need it. If you are taking the other end of the scale, whether this is a sole practitioner or somebody in a relatively small firm facing the challenges of, poor legal aid rates, poor legal aid provision. Often you don't have time to think about this. You probably are more exposed to AI when you use social media in some way than you actually are in your business, because you don't have the time or the resource to do it. And that's where an organisation like the Law Society has to come in. So it's why we've done guidance or assistance about, how to buy legal tech, questions to ask and things like that for those smaller firms. I mean, the bigger firms, it's important to interact with them, to talk to them about it, to understand things from their perspective, to provide advice, guidance and things like that. But for some of the bigger firms, I mean, I'll give you an example. This is not location dropping, which is a version of name dropping, but when I was in Singapore talking to one of the big firms, what they said to me, well, look, I mean, AI's been great for us, this system that we've built in-house, because we service a number of clients, we do hugely brilliant work for them, but there's a cost to it. And there comes a point with some of the work that they want doing that we can't possibly give them the service that we think they want and we think that we want to be associated with at the kind of price that would make sense for the work that they need doing. And a lot of that is sometimes in relatively lower value but document heavy work. And what they said is that now with the use of AI tailored to how their business works, we can actually do that work. And from a business perspective, being able to service all of the needs of one of your major clients is important as well. So it's not just about speed, it's about how you deploy it. But take yourself back to the high street in Burnley. Have they got the time to think about things like that? And again, that's where the Law Society has to come in. I think people are curious about it, which is a wonderful word, and an important word, but they need help in identifying what it might do, how it might work, and what are the risks for them as a business as well. So it's the classic stuff that you expect a membership organisation that exists on behalf of its members should be doing.
Yeah, I think comparing the two, Burnley, Singapore, quite a difference in location, right?
Yeah, weather's better.
I think it's a great example, and I see the biggest problem is resources, time for sure, and it does make me think, what does the future look like for all of these different types of law firms? Because obviously the big ones, I know firms like Simmons and Simmons, for example, they are steamrolling ahead. They've even, yesterday I saw a post about them delivering I want to say it was like an AI law scheme or something, and it's kind of like a vacation scheme but specifically for AI and law, and I was like, wow, what a brilliant idea that is. And they've just got such great ideas, but then when you compare the high street firms, they're doing something completely different because they just don't have that resource that massive firms have. So I do wonder what happens in the future with all these firms,
The approach of bigger firms like that, in a way, brings us full circle back to what I was talking about earlier, which is it's important to figure out why or what the AI is going to be doing, how you're going to deploy it in your business, because you don't see those bigger firms saying, you know what, we've got this class of case that we're just going to give to the AI and let it just deal with it. And, there you go. You paid for that. There's the outcome. They use it strategically to augment what it is their workforce actually does. So if you take a step outside our jurisdiction and you go to America, then you look at the statistics that come from their version of the Department of Business and Trade, for example, the Labour Department, and they're predicting a 5% growth in numbers of lawyers within firms. So they're predicting that, the numbers involved in firms will increase. And if you think about that, that's right, because if you are augmenting what the individual does, they are in effect moving more of the work that you employ them to do, then you start to see opportunities to do more of that type of work. And if you can augment it and get better return on that work while still maintaining those quality standards that the legal profession is synonymous with, then that's just a simple business decision, isn't it? that you will use it to enable growth, to simplify certain elements of work, the things that are possible to be automated, that can be done safely, that can be checked what goes in and what comes out, which is the classic way all the way back to Charles Babbage talking about garbage in and garbage out, that was eventually in effect nicked by IBM and adopted. That tells its own tale as well, because if you think about the original computer built by Charles Babbage, he built it to answer mathematical questions, and the actual moment where algorithms and where we are now launched was when someone called Ada Lovelace made that intuitive leap that it could be used in relation to non-mathematical problems by programming it, by using algorithms. Here we are now because a lady made an intuitive leap when she looked at a thing and said, actually, why don't we do that with it? That's the innovation that sits at the heart of what lawyers have always done.
If we kind of take a step back and we look at how AI is developing so fast and we apply that to the legal industry, from your kind of point of view within the Law Society, who kind of actually controls that development? Because we have Anthropic coming out with all different types of plugins, and they even came out with a legal plugin, and probably law firms within the UK are using that. I know ones in the US are. Who controls the development of legal AI, and do you think it creates a new kind of power balance, power structure within the legal system?
Well, I think probably the first thing to say, and it'll sound a bit BBC, there are other providers as well as Anthropic, but the point leads into another issue. So when I was talking to some PI lawyers, because I still deliver some training for PI lawyers, firms that I've always helped out, they've bought into something called Co-Counsel, and they're all very excited about it. They're quite a tech-forward firm, to be honest. And generally people were saying, so this is 6 months later, I'd been back, I said, how's it going? They said, it's okay. That was what they said. It's okay. So they've gone from this hugely, it's going to change everything, we'll be fine, no problem, we're ready for the future, to, yeah, it's okay. Which doesn't mean it's terrible, but does that dose of reality come in? But I mean, back to your question, when you think about this, the large language model depends on what information goes in. And much of that is across the water in the Atlantic. So a bigger bit of water than what we usually talk about. So all the way to America. A lot of that comes from, effectively trawling the internet, putting information in. There's no control over what information goes in. I think you've talked to Sarah Stevens, Sarah Stevens, who I worked with on the OPRC as well at some point. And, she built this system in Tanzania. And one of the things that came out when we were talking about it is that not many things are either written down or put on the internet in Africa. And when you looked at the percentage of, in effect, African content that goes into a large language model, it's very, very low. So if you ask AI a question, it's going to answer it on the basis of the information it's got. And what people want are local solutions. So if you are in Africa and you ask it a question, it's probably going to, recommend Coca-Cola products, for want of a better way of putting it. It's going to give you a very Western American-centric answer. So to some extent, what goes in, there is a degree of control there. But the use of AI, properly done within the legal system, is not about asking it to make decisions. In fact, there's a risk in a common law system in allowing it to make decisions. We end up with the law not developing. So if you're using it in an administrative function to augment, and the ultimate decision about what then happens with the information it's packaged up for you and given you in a more accessible format, then that's really important, because the human in the loop has another function there. It keeps it more like what your justice system expects to see as your version of justice. And the other difficulty is it's broadly just a data protection issue. It is your client's data. It's not yours. If you put it into something that doesn't have guardrails. So if you were to use the public version of ChatGPT, it will use that information to train its models on. And, we deal with confidential information. There are things that people tell me as a lawyer that, perhaps they, I don't know, don't even tell the priest or something like that. I mean, that sounds far more exciting than it actually is. But the truth is, there's an expectation of privacy, and we need to ensure that that continues, because one of the ways of ensuring that someone has access to justice is the ability to have those conversations with someone in a private space. So there's all of those reasons. And I think that's why, some proper thought as to how, we sit as a country within how large language models are trained and how we think about what goes in really matters. I talked about, I was asked to talk about gender bias when I was in, it sounds like place dropping again, in Vietnam for Law Asia. So I was the only male member of a, other than me, fully female panel, which was actually a really nice role reversal and a nice experience, because just different thought processes and things like that. And I think I scared the person from the Law Society when I said, that speech you've written me, I've rewritten it, some bits of it. What are you going to talk about? Well, I'm going to talk about the Hillsborough disaster, and I'm going to talk about the Supreme Court decision on gender equality and the Equality Act, which is not what you want to hear from someone you've never heard speak before. But the point about the Supreme Court decision was quite simple. It wasn't about taking sides or having a view in relation to that. But if you allow somebody to take a decision as to what goes into a large language model, then the obvious point is that they also decide what doesn't go in. So somebody could decide that they didn't agree with what is a very polarized discussion about a particular issue and say, well, we're not going to put that in our large language model. So the next decision that's made, if you allow AI to make decisions rather than augment intelligence, you end up with an outcome that doesn't take that into account, and someone has effectively overruled the Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the UK. Now, that's okay if Parliament does that. If Parliament said, you know what, we're going to overrule that decision of the Supreme Court. But that's not how large language models are trained. So exclusion of data can matter just as much. So that, yes, there is a risk, but I think that has to be identified, recognised and managed.
I would love to touch more on what you mentioned about the bias side of things, because not many people actually talk about this. And I think you specifically are coming from a unique authority to talk about it. So I'd love to take advantage of speaking to you about that, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, no, that's understandable, yeah. Firstly, I'll just explain the Hillsborough reference, and this is the other danger. So if you go back to what we talked about earlier about how AI broadly works, that it's probabilities based upon all this data that it's got, what it aims for effectively is the middle of the bell curve. So the reason I talked about the Hillsborough disaster was that that was a seminal moment in personal injury, because the court decided that secondary victims should be recognised, seen, and also have access to help in rebuilding their shattered life, to the compensation that leads to that. And that was such an intuitive leap. And if an AI had been asked to decide that case, it would have headed for the middle of the bell curve, and that wouldn't have been a probable outcome whatsoever. So it isn't just a question of potential bias in data that goes in. It's about what's done with the data. So at each of the different points along the path to a decision being made, what you put in, how does it figure out the outcome, to what do you do with it, how do you check it and make sure it actually represents either the moving forward of society through the common law or what is the outcome that society would expect at the time, all really, really matter. And the bias is potentially ingrained in it, because if you hand over the ability to make decisions to something that just works on probability based on a data set you've given it, then that data set really matters. So, I mean, there's a pretty good example of Amazon in 2018 using AI as a recruitment tool. And when you went through it, it sounds like a great idea, doesn't it? I mean, unless you're the person who's having to talk to the AI to try and get a job, which I imagine is relatively soul destroying. But because it'd been fed on a data set that was broadly male based, in other words, that was traditionally how they'd hired in this data set that was given. Nobody realized at first, but what it was doing was actually marking down female applicants. Women weren't getting roles, and someone said, hang on a minute, this output here, why is it like this? And when they looked at it, it was because it was making assumptions based upon the data set that it had been given. So that's a really powerful example of that, garbage in problem. If it doesn't reflect society at the moment that society's in, then it will continue to perpetuate problems that were there. It's that classic one, you should learn from history as opposed to repeat the mistakes of it. And that's the danger in bias. There's also, examples of models that have been trained on facial recognition, focusing on particular types or classes of individual because, that model had an inherent bias in it that, that in fairness, someone probably didn't realize when they were looking at it. They said, usual statistical question, is it a representative data set we have? Yes, it looks like it. It's certainly large. We'll shove it in there. And that's why you've got to be mindful of what goes in and then checking the output at the other end, which is the garbage out.
I think if AI uses things from the past, then how do we kind of develop the law? Like you say, what do you, out of interest, what do you think AI would have decided for the Hill? What do you think the outcome would have been for the Hillsborough case?
I don't think we would have had a secondary victims law. I think it would have decided the most likely or probable outcome based upon a series of earlier decisions that the court said were misunderstandings of the core principles and negligence. I don't think it would have been, in a way, brave enough to do that, which sometimes it takes someone who's made an intuitive leap, or sometimes it's just bloody minded to say, no, this is how it should work. And that's how the common law develops, because the common law is a reflection of society at the time. So that by the time someone came to make a decision post Hillsborough, their view was very different from judges who perhaps sat on similar type cases 50, 100, however many more years before. And if we lose that ability to be flexible and develop, then we lose one of the things that is most attractive about our jurisdiction to other jurisdictions in the world, back to us being the mother of common law and having this reputation as being flexible in how the courts approach newer technologies, newer types of dispute and things like that. So there is a ruthlessly commercial streak to ensuring that our common law system both works and is seen to work properly, rather than it being handed over to some kind of version of black box justice where you stick it in and it tells you a 1 or a 0, win or lose, and that's it. You've got nothing to do after that.
I think this is an important conversation, actually, because it kind of exposes the fact that if AI develops so much in a way that we can't control it, or we don't regulate it in a certain way and don't kind of protect the jurisdiction, then what happens to common law?
It's something who writes a lot about case law, something that you would think about and worry about, because it's what you do. And you've seen, over the years, I've reached a certain age, an old age, as my daughter would tell me these days, of 51, where I've seen, aspects of the law develop. And when you start to think about losing that thread, for example, in negligence, of it being so context specific and being able to be malleable and workable for a variety of different problems, you start to think, actually, that's really something worth defending, worth keeping, that flexibility, that ability to problem solve for an individual, because that's what most clients want. They don't come to you saying, actually, I've got a claim for negligence and a claim under the Occupiers Liability Act 1957. They say, I've got a problem. What can I do about it? And, to some extent, the law should be flexible in helping with that.
What would you say in terms of, going back to the bias point, if we use AI to make decisions, which we already kind of are doing, And you hear about a lot of cases, especially in the US, about people really relying on AI for cases. And it gives that illusion of fairness. What's the risk there? Because obviously AI really is biased and it looks at old decisions, it looks at old ways of working. What is the risk there in terms of if it gives this illusion of fairness, but the reality is it's not inherently fair?
Through the years of building digital systems with the Civil Procedure Rule Committee and then latterly the online version of it, which sounds like a grand rebranding, but it is grossly different in approach, I've come to think that principles first really matter. That if you are trying to make sense of how this new technology fits within what people think of as justice, it's first very important to define what justice is. And, we come back to core principles that Law Society regularly talk about and defend, like rule of law and access to justice. So the ability of someone to get access to justice, to get their problem solved and resolved. And if you don't do that, then there's very good arguments that things get worse. So, imagine someone who's injured in an accident at work and then falls out with their employer and their employer dismisses them, and then they don't have any income, and then they can't pay for their rent. You've got a whole series of different things that start to develop as a consequence of not having that early intervention. So, the truth of it is that justice should really be thought about in the same way that we talk about or feel about the NHS. Being a PI lawyer, I'm very, very much aware that often I would have been a distressed purchase. In other words, people don't think much about what a PI lawyer does until they actually need one. And then it becomes really apparent what it matters to be able to get justice, as much as it matters in relation to other primary services that a grown-up democracy provides.
I think we've got this theme going throughout this conversation, which is having that human touch and keeping and maintaining that human touch in the legal system.
Yeah, again, principles matter. So, over that time doing that kind of work, I've become, in a way, more focused on the principles. So, for example, if you're building a digital justice system, what is wrong with having as a first principle, in effect, a version of first do no harm? If I digitize part of this process, then it shouldn't make things worse. It should actually solve or improve the lot of the user, as opposed to making it more complicated or more restrictive or less accessible. So that's why, part of the work on the OPRC is so important when we think about inclusion. You wouldn't have imagined that, a bunch of black letter law rule makers would actually be so focused on the additional concept of inclusion. But actually, when you step back and think about what each of those rule makers got involved in the law for, it was to help people, to be a problem solver. And, you can't have your problem solved if you've got nowhere to go for the help. And that's the critical point. Make it better and more accessible for all those that need that help.
Well, it's been absolutely fascinating getting your perspectives, which are unique perspectives. I think I mentioned to you when we first spoke.
Mm-hmm.
Normally I speak to lawyers, law firms, in-house counsel, but I've never spoken to anyone from the Law Society or from someone in your kind of position in terms of from your perspective, which is super interesting.
The truth is that, if I think about how or why I've ended up where I am, it is because I initially wanted to help people. I probably should have done computer science, but they couldn't timetable it at sixth form. So I ended up doing humanities instead, geography, English literature, history. But underlying it all, I am a complete geek. So I think about systems and how things sit together. So from a very early stage, I thought about, well, I'm helping just one person here. What about if I could help more? If I could have an effect on a more macro scale? So that's when I became involved with the Association of Personal Injury Lawyers and ultimately went on to be their president, and then why I got involved in rulemaking. And one of my proudest moments in terms of rulemaking was introducing the vulnerability provisions to the civil procedural. So, if you are someone who is vulnerable, then you should have the same access to the court system as everybody else. You should be entitled to have adaptation so you can give your best evidence. And that really explains the natural transition into the Law Society, where there is the opportunity to work with a group of, very, very committed individuals to deliver on, some of those broader themes about what justice matters and why it matters and how to go about that. So I think I've got more niche, but just on a wider scale in some respects. It's a different perspective. You're thinking about the system as opposed to the thing that's in front of you.
You're looking at the bigger picture, really, and how it can affect everybody. And I think that's really, really important, especially with your mindset. You are cautious about AI, but you're also forward thinking, and you want to innovate and be able to, I guess, democratize the justice system as well. So I think it's great.
I want it to work for as many people as possible. I mean, that's the first thing. You can make all kinds of very interesting things, but if it doesn't work, what was the point?
Exactly.
So we're in that moment, I think, at this time.
Definitely, we're in a very exciting moment, I think, for law and for lawyers, for sure.
Yes,
even
definitely.
if they don't think it.
Well, we lawyers are conservative with a small c sometimes, aren't they? But they are actually at their heart innovators and problem solvers, and that's the most useful quality to have in this world that's changing.